The door to the Aldridge ranch swung open with a bang that sent the three hens roosting on the porch rail scattering into the pale morning air, and Emma Aldridge came out with a shotgun leveled at the chest of the tall, sun-bronzed stranger who had ridden up the lane like he owned the place. Because, as he was about to inform her with an infuriating calm, he believed that he did. The year was 1882, and the New Mexico Territory was not a place where a woman alone could afford to put her weapon down before she had her answers. Emma had learned that lesson the hard way, and she intended to keep on applying it. She was 24 years old and had spent the better part of 3 of those years turning the Aldridge spread from a sun-bleached wreck into something that could actually sustain a small cattle operation. She had blistered her hands on fence posts, argued bank managers into giving her extensions, and once chased a coyote out of the chicken house with nothing but a broom and pure nerve. She was not going to be undone by one man with a piece of paper and a fine horse. He sat on that horse, a handsome gray mare, and he did not flinch at the shotgun. That alone told her something. Men who flinched were either innocent or calculating. Men who did not flinch were usually one of 2 things: very dangerous or very confident in their position. The stranger appeared to be the latter, though she reserved judgment. He was broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had gone a little long beneath a battered hat, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested he had prepared himself for some version of this confrontation. His eyes, she noted despite herself, were the clear, steady gray of storm clouds before the rain actually arrived. "I am going to need you to lower that barrel," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried. "Not because I think it makes you look foolish, because it does not, but because I rode a long way to have a conversation, and I would rather we had it without either of us losing an eye." "Who are you?" Emma said, and it was not a question so much as a demand. "Gilbert Lawson," he said. He reached slowly, the way a man does when he is aware of every muscle he moves, into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a folded envelope. "And I have documentation here from a land office in Santa Fe that names me as the deed holder of the property currently known as the Aldridge Ranch, which before that was known as the Holloway parcel, which my uncle purchased in 1871. The words hit her like cold water thrown from a bucket. She did not lower the shotgun. "Your uncle," she said. "Franklin Lawson," he said. "He died in January, left the land to me. I have the original deed, the transfer documentation, and a letter from the Territorial Land Office confirming the ownership in my name." He extended the envelope a little further, the way a man extends bread to a spooked horse. "I would be grateful if you would look at it." "And I would be grateful," Emma said tightly, "if you would explain how a man could own land that my father bought and paid for in 1877. That gave him pause. She could see him recalibrating, the way a good chess player does when his opponent makes a move he had not anticipated. "Your father," he said carefully. "Thomas Aldridge. He purchased this land from a man named Warren Greer in the spring of 1877. I have that deed inside, filed with the Colfax County Recorder's Office." She kept the shotgun level. "So before either of us does anything we regret, I suggest you climb down off that horse and come tell me how 2 different men can own the same piece of ground." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in those gray eyes, not fear, not anger, but something that looked almost like respect. "That," he said, stepping down from the saddle with the easy movement of a man who had been climbing on and off horses his whole life, "is an excellent question." He tied the mare to the porch rail, which the hens had now abandoned entirely, and he followed Emma inside with his hat in his hand. She kept the shotgun with her, propped against the wall close enough to reach but far enough to indicate she was willing to hear him out. The interior of the ranch house was spare but not poor. There was a good table, a cast iron stove that had been blackened with honest use, curtains that Emma had sewn herself from flour sacking, and a bolt of blue cotton she had traded for in Cimarron. The walls held a few practical things: a calendar, a hook for her coat, a small framed daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. It was a home. It looked and felt like a home, and Gilbert Lawson, standing in the middle of it with his hat in both hands, seemed to understand that because the certainty that had been in his posture when he rode up had gone a shade quieter. Emma set 2 documents on the table. He set 3. They read each other's papers in silence. The problem became clear within 10 minutes. Franklin Lawson had purchased the Holloway parcel, this land, in 1871, legitimately from a man named Jedediah Holloway. Warren Greer, the man who sold the land to Thomas Aldridge in 1877, had not owned it. Greer had apparently sold the same parcel to at least 2 different men, pocketed the money both times, and vanished into the Western Territories before anyone was the wiser. Warren Greer was a fraud, Emma said flatly. It appears so, Gilbert said. He had taken a seat at the table, she had not offered it, and he had not asked, which told her he was comfortable making himself at home, and that this fact would likely irritate her repeatedly in coming days. Your father was deceived. My father is dead, Emma said. He died in 1879, 2 years after he bought this land in good faith and spent every dollar he had improving it. She looked up from the papers. I have been running this ranch for 3 years. I have cattle out in that pasture, a hired hand who comes 3 days a week, a mortgage with the Cimarron Bank that I have been making payments on, and a contract with a rancher in Springer to deliver 50 head by October. So whatever your documentation says, Mr. Lawson, this is not simply a vacant lot you have ridden up to claim. He was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands twice. No, he said, it is not. He looked around the room again, and she could see him taking it in properly this time, not as an obstacle but as a reality. I can see that. What do you intend to do? He was quiet for a moment longer than was comfortable. I intend, he said slowly, to find out exactly what we are dealing with before I do anything. He met her eyes. I did not ride 400 miles to throw a woman off a working ranch the day I arrived. But I also cannot simply walk away from a legal deed to property I was left by a man I spent the better part of my life working for. Emma studied him. There was something straightforward about the way he said it, no bluster, no threats, no attempt to overwhelm her with the authority of his paperwork. Just a statement of the situation as he saw it, with the corners left honest and visible. Where did you come from? She asked. Colorado, he said. I had a cattle operation up near Pueblo, sold it after my uncle died. He raised me, my uncle Franklin did, after my mother passed. When he left me this land, it was the last thing he had to give me. He said that last part simply, without asking for sympathy, which was the only way she might have considered offering any. And you sold your Colorado operation. I did. So you have nothing to go back to. That is correct. She looked at the papers again. She looked at the daguerreotype of her parents. She thought about her father's hands, how rough they had gotten in those last 2 years when he had worked himself beyond what any man his age ought to have done, trying to make something out of this land for her, trying to leave her something that would last. He had not known the man who sold it to him was a liar. He had done everything right and still been cheated. And Gilbert Lawson's uncle had done everything right and had his deed sit dormant for 11 years while the land changed hands beneath it. 2 honest men, 1 dishonest one, and here were the pieces they had left behind. I am not leaving this ranch, Emma said, not angry, not desperate, just factual. I'm not asking you to, Gilbert said, and the quiet steadiness of his reply caught her off guard in a way the shotgun on the wall had not. Not today. He stood, picking up his hat. I would like to ride the property if you will allow it, get a look at what is here. Then I would like to go into Cimarron tomorrow and speak with the land office and with a lawyer if there is one worth speaking to. There is one, Emma said. Howard Bellamy. He is honest enough. He helped me with the bank paperwork. Gilbert nodded. He put his hat on and moved toward the door, then stopped. Is there somewhere I can put my horse up for the night? He asked. I will sleep in the barn if the stable is full. Emma almost told him to ride back toward town and find a hotel, but she looked at the gray mare through the window, and the mare looked tired from a long road, and whatever else Gilbert Lawson might be, The condition of his horse told her he was not a cruel man. "The stable has 3 empty stalls," she said. "You can have one of them." He nodded again and went out, and Emma stood in the middle of her kitchen with her hands flat on the table and the documents spread beneath them, and tried to decide whether she had just made the most reasonable decision of her life or the most foolish one. She decided she would know soon enough. The property was larger than Gilbert had expected. He rode the fence lines that afternoon while Emma worked in the kitchen garden near the house, close enough to watch him without appearing to. The land ran to about 320 acres, with a good creek cutting through the lower third of it, stands of cottonwood along the water, and pasture grass that had been managed well enough to support a respectable herd. The cattle he could see from horseback were in decent condition, not fat, but solid and healthy. Someone had done real work here. He came back in the early evening and found Emma at the fence near the stable, mending a section that had come loose. She was not waiting for him to do it. She was not waiting for anyone to do anything. She had a pair of leather gloves on and a hammer in her hand, and she was methodically driving staples into fence posts with a practiced efficiency that suggested she had done this particular job many times before. He got down off the mare and tied her without being asked and came to the fence. "Hand me those staples," he said, nodding toward the tin on the post beside her. She looked at him, not surprised exactly, evaluating. She handed him the tin. They worked the fence together for an hour without talking very much, and when they did talk it was about practical things, the section of creek bank that had eroded since spring, the condition of the south pasture, whether the cattle were likely to come down from the high ground before the weather turned. He knew cattle. She could hear it in the questions he asked, the things he noticed. That, too, told her something. When the fence was done, Emma made supper because she made supper every night regardless of who was or was not standing in her kitchen, and because the alternative was letting the man ride into town and come back with whatever opinions the people there had put in his head about how to handle a dispute over land. She preferred to have him where she could see him and where she could manage the narrative. He ate without complaint and with evident appreciation, and he cleared his own plate without being asked and stacked it neatly with hers beside the basin. "I want to ask you something," he said, standing near the door with his hat in his hands again. She was beginning to notice that he always held his hat when he was about to say something he was uncertain of. "And I want you to understand I am asking because I think it matters, not because I am looking for an advantage." "Ask," Emma said. "Why did you let me in?" he said. "You had the gun. You could have sent me back down the lane and found yourself a lawyer before I could get to one. You had every reason to do that, but you let me in and you showed me your paperwork and you have fed me supper." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" Emma was quiet for a moment. She dried her hands on the cloth hanging by the basin and turned to face him. "Because you did not lie to me," she said. "You rode up here and told me exactly what you believed to be true and why you believed it. A man who intended to cheat me would have had a better story prepared." She held his gaze. "And because this situation is not your fault any more than it is mine. Warren Greer made this mess. It seems reasonable that you and I should try to unmake it together rather than spending money we do not have on lawyers fighting each other." He was quiet for a long moment. He turned his hat once. "I think that is the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in a considerable while," he said. "Good night, Mr. Lawson," Emma said, and went to her room. The ride into Cimarron the next morning took just over an hour at a steady pace. They went together, which raised some eyebrows in town because Emma Aldridge was known, and the tall stranger at her side was not. She rode her own horse, a sturdy bay she called Copperhead, and Gilbert rode the gray mare, and they went side by side down the main street of Cimarron in the September light with the mountains visible to the west, purple and distant and enormous. Howard Bellamy had an office above the general store. He was a slight man with spectacles and quick, intelligent eyes, and he listened to both of them without interrupting, which was a quality Emma had always appreciated in him. When they had finished, He read the documents. He read them twice. "This is a land fraud case," he said. "Warren Greer sold land he did not have legal authority to sell when he sold it to your father, Miss Aldridge. Mr. Lawson's uncle held the original and legitimate deed. That makes Mr. Lawson's claim the senior claim in terms of legal standing." Emma felt the words like a fist to the chest, but she kept her face still. "However," Bellamy continued, taking his spectacles off and polishing them with a small cloth, "the improvements made to the property under your family's ownership, the buildings, the fencing, the cultivation, the cattle operation, those represent significant invested value. The question before us is not simply who holds the deed, but what a court would say about the equitable interest your family has established over 6 years of occupancy and improvement." "What would a court say?" Gilbert asked. "A territorial court might rule either way," Bellamy said. "I have seen such cases go to the original deed holder, and I have seen them acknowledge the equitable interest of the occupying party. It would depend largely on the judge and the documentation of improvements." He looked at both of them over the rims of his spectacles. "I would suggest, given the cost and uncertainty of litigation, that the two of you consider whether a private arrangement might serve you better than the courts." "What sort of arrangement?" Emma asked. "That," Bellamy said, "would be between the two of you." They walked out of his office into the September sun and stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the general store. A wagon rolled past. A dog sleeping in the shade of the farrier's shop lifted its head and then put it back down. The mountains were the same purple and distant as they had been an hour ago. "What does a private arrangement look like to you?" Gilbert asked. He was looking at the mountains, not at her. Emma thought. She was good at thinking clearly under pressure. It was perhaps the most useful thing she had ever learned. "The land is yours," she said, and saying it cost her something, but she said it plainly. "Your uncle bought it first in good faith. Your deed is the senior deed. I am not going to pretend otherwise." She paused. "But the improvements, the house, the stable, the fencing, the pasture work, the water management, those represent every dollar my father had in 3 years of my labor. A fair arrangement would account for that." "What would be fair?" he asked. He turned to look at her now. "A partnership," she said. "A genuine one. The land is yours. The operation we have built is mine. You provide the land and whatever capital you can bring. I provide the operation, the relationships. I know these ranchers. I know this country. I know who to sell to and when. We split the profits." She held his gaze. "In the meantime, I keep my home. You may have the spare room in the house or the barn. Either is a decent place to sleep." She half expected him to laugh. Or to counter with something smaller. Or to simply tell her he would think about it, which in her experience was what men said when they had already decided no. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that held the quality of steady weather, and he said, "That is a fair offer." "It is," Emma agreed. "I accept it," he said. She put out her hand. He shook it. His hand was large and roughened by work, and the grip was honest. "We should get that in writing," Emma said, "while Bellamy is still upstairs." "Absolutely," Gilbert said, and they went back up. October arrived with a cold snap that turned the cottonwoods along the creek gold and copper, and set the cattle moving restlessly. Emma and Gilbert spent the first weeks of the month in an uneasy choreography, learning where the other stood in the kitchen, learning the other's schedule, the other's habits, the way they each took their coffee and managed the morning. He was an early riser, which she had not expected. She was herself up before dawn most mornings, and she had assumed she would have the kitchen to herself for at least an hour. Instead, she came down the first morning to find the stove already lit and coffee already on, and Gilbert sitting at the table, reading a week-old newspaper from Santa Fe, with the concentrated expression of a man determined to catch up on what the world had been doing without him. He looked up when she came in. "Coffee is hot," he said, and went back to his paper. She poured a cup and sat down with her own work, the ledger books, the contracts, the list of things that needed doing before winter pressed in, and they sat in the same room doing their separate work, and the silence between them was not unfriendly. That was, she would think later, perhaps the first real sign. Jesse Prout, her hired hand, arrived on his usual Tuesday morning and took one long look at Gilbert saddling his horse in the stable yard, and came to find Emma with a look that walked the line between concerned and amused. Jesse was 60 years old, had been a trail driver for 20 years before a broken leg that healed crooked had retired him from the long drives, and he had a face that looked like the country itself, weathered and honest and full of old light. He had worked for Emma's father before her, and he had worked for Emma since, and he was loyal in the quiet, uncomplicated way of a man who did not have a lot of words but chose the right ones when he used them. "Who is that?" Jesse asked. Emma explained. It took a while. Jesse listened with his arms crossed and his expression moving from concerned to more concerned, and then, as she finished, settling into something thoughtful. "And you trust him," Jesse said. It was not quite a question. "I trust his paperwork," Emma said, "and he has given me no reason not to trust him otherwise." "Men can be patient about showing their reasons," Jesse said. "Jesse," Emma said gently, "I have a shotgun and I know how to use it, and I know this land better than anyone alive. I am going to be all right." Jesse looked at her for a moment, and then nodded the way he always nodded when he accepted something he did not entirely like. "All right," he said, and went to introduce himself to Gilbert, and Emma watched through the stable door window as the two men shook hands and something that looked like cautious mutual assessment passed between them. She did not realize she had been holding her breath until she let it go. The cattle drive to Springer happened in the second week of October, and Emma had organized it down to the hour. She had contracted with a rancher named Don Abernathy for 50 head at a price she had negotiated in August, and she was not going to miss the delivery date because she had a new and complicated situation at the ranch. She told Gilbert she was going with Jesse and a temporary driver named Cal, who she hired seasonally, and that he could hold the ranch. Gilbert said he was coming. Emma said that was not necessary. Gilbert said he could see it was not necessary, but that he intended to come anyway because he was a partner and a cattle drive to Springer was a legitimate part of the partnership business, and also because he had been driving cattle since he was 16 years old, and an extra set of experienced hands was never a liability on the trail. Emma looked at him for a moment and then at Jesse, who was examining the sky with great interest. "Fine," Emma said. The drive was 4 days out and 3 back. 50 head of range cattle through territory that was mostly good ground but had its difficult stretches, particularly a rocky crossing over a creek that had come up with the autumn rain. Gilbert was, she had to concede, exactly what he said he was: experienced, capable, and useful on a cattle drive. He knew how to read a herd's mood, how to move around them, how to turn a drifting steer back without pushing the rest of the group into agitation. He was also, she discovered on the second night camped beside the creek with the fire burning low, a man who could tell a story. It came out because Cal, the seasonal driver, asked Gilbert where he had come from. People always asked, in the West of 1882, because the West was full of people who had come from somewhere else carrying whatever their somewhere else had given them. And Gilbert had told them about the Colorado operation, and then about following his uncle up from Texas when he was 8 years old, and somehow that had opened a door and the stories came out, not in a performed way, but in the easy way of a man sitting beside a fire who has had a long day, and finds himself in company that does not require pretending. He told them about his Uncle Franklin, a big red-haired Irishman who had come to Texas by way of Louisiana and to New Mexico by way of a series of decisions that made sense at the time. He told them about a winter in Colorado when the snow came in October and did not leave until May, and he and his uncle had been snowed in with nothing to do but read every book in the house and play cards and argue about which of them was right about everything. He told them that his uncle had been right about most things, as it turned out, and that he had spent the 11 years since Franklin's mind had begun to fail trying to make good on the principles the old man had given him. Emma sat across the fire and listened. She said almost nothing, because the stories were not about her and she understood by instinct that this was not a moment for performance. She just listened, and the firelight moved across Gilbert Lawson's face, and she felt something she did not name yet settle into the space behind her breastbone like a stone finding its resting place on a riverbed. Jesse caught her looking. He said nothing. He simply looked back at the fire. The delivery to Don Abernathy went smoothly. Abernathy was a practical man in his 50s who counted the cattle carefully and paid in cash, which Emma preferred, and who asked about the ranch's plans for the coming year. Emma told him they intended to expand the herd if the winter was manageable, and she introduced Gilbert as her partner in the operation. Abernathy looked at Gilbert with the assessing squint of a man who has dealt with a lot of people over a lot of years. "Lawson," he said. "Any relation to Franklin Lawson, had some land down towards Cimarron." "His nephew," Gilbert said. Abernathy nodded. "Good man, Franklin, quiet type, new cattle." He looked at Emma. "You done well, Miss Aldridge. This is a quality herd." Emma felt the warmth of that the way she felt the warmth of a fire after a cold ride, fully, and with gratitude. On the ride back, something had changed between her and Gilbert, though she would have been hard-pressed at that moment to say what it was. The edge had gone out of the air between them. It was not that they had become close, exactly. It was more that they had become comfortable, the way two people become comfortable when they have shared enough days of honest work to stop wondering about each other's intentions and simply trust the evidence. They rode beside each other for long stretches without talking, and the silence was the good kind. November came in cold and busy. There was wood to cut and stack, the root cellar to finish filling, a section of roof on the stable that had developed a worrying sag and needed reinforcing before the snow came. Emma and Gilbert worked alongside each other through all of it, and Jesse worked with them when he came, and the ranch moved toward winter the way a good ranch does, with purpose and without panic. One evening in the middle of November, Emma came in from the root cellar to find Gilbert at the stove, making something that smelled better than anything she had managed to produce that week. She stood in the doorway and looked at him, his back to her, his sleeves rolled up, completely absorbed in what he was doing, and she felt that stone in her chest shift and settle again, and this time she let herself acknowledge what it was. She was in danger of falling for him, not because he was handsome, though he was, not because he was useful, though he was that too, but because he had shown up to a complicated situation with honesty and steadiness, and a complete absence of the kind of arrogance that the same situation could so easily have produced. He had not tried to take her ranch from her. He had not minimized what she had built. He had looked at everything she had and said, quietly and without ceremony, that it deserved to be respected. She went to the basin and washed her hands and sat down at the table. "What are you making?" she asked. "Bean soup," he said. "My uncle's recipe, which is to say it is a recipe that exists entirely in my memory with no written record, so some of the proportions are estimations." "Is the estimation edible?" "Usually," he said, and she laughed, which surprised them both. He turned from the stove at the sound of it, and something crossed his face, a swift, unguarded brightness, before he turned back and stirred the pot. They ate the soup, which was in fact quite good, and over supper Emma told him about the town meeting she had attended in Cimarron that week, where the question of new grazing regulations had come up, and she had argued against the proposed restrictions along the creek corridor that would have reduced the grazing access for small operations like theirs. She had won the argument, largely by knowing the creek's seasonal patterns better than anyone else in the room. Gilbert listened to all of it and asked sharp, interested questions, and Emma found herself talking more than she usually did, more freely, with more of the texture of how she actually thought about things, and when she noticed it she felt both pleased and faintly alarmed. "You are good at that," he said when she finished. "At arguing in those meetings, at making people listen." "My father taught me that," she said. "He said the most important thing in any argument was to know more than the person you were arguing with. He said preparation was just respect for the truth." Gilbert was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man I knew," Emma said. There was nothing sentimental in her voice, just the plain and settled weight of truth. "He did not deserve to be cheated." "No," Gilbert said. "He did not." He looked at her directly. "I want you to know I have thought about this a great deal, that what Warren Greer did to your father was wrong in a way that my legal claim does not erase. I hold the deed, but your family paid for this land honestly. Both of those things are true." She looked at him across the table. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I mean it," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That is why I am thanking you." That was the night Emma stopped being simply cautious around Gilbert Lawson. December brought the first serious snow, and with it a crisis that neither of them had anticipated. 3 of the horses came down with a respiratory illness that moved through the stable fast and hit hard. One of them was Copperhead, Emma's bay, who had been her horse for 5 years, and whose loss would have been more than practical. It would have been a grief. Gilbert sat up through 2 nights running, checking on the horses, applying warm poultices and making sure they had clean water, going out into the cold dark of the stable every hour to see how they were doing. Emma did the same, and on the second night they sat together in the straw of Copperhead's stall at 2 in the morning with a lantern between them, and the horses labored, breathing the only sound, and Emma was frightened in the quiet way she allowed herself to be frightened when no one was watching, except that Gilbert was watching, and she could not quite bring herself to put the mask back on. "I cannot lose him," she said. "You are not going to lose him," Gilbert said. He said it with the particular quality of certainty that is not a dismissal of reality, but rather a decision to hold a steadier line than reality is currently offering. "He is strong, and we caught it early. He is going to be all right. You do not know that." "No," he admitted, "but I believe it, and right now that is what we have." She leaned her head back against the stall wall. The lantern flickered. Copperhead's breathing was still rough but had been slightly better in the last hour. "Tell me something," she said, "about Colorado, about anything." So he talked. He told her about the mountains above Pueblo, how they looked in the early spring when the snowpack was still on the high peaks, but the lower meadows had started to green. He told her about a summer storm he had ridden through that had been so intense the air turned green before it hit. He told her about a dog he had when he was a boy, a spotted hound his uncle had brought home, that had been the most stubborn animal ever born, but had loved his Uncle Franklin with an absolute and devoted loyalty that had outlasted every practical expectation. Emma listened with her eyes half closed and the warmth of the lantern on her face. Copperhead survived. By morning he was standing, and by the end of the week he was eating, and within a month he was as solid as he had ever been. Emma came out on the morning when Copperhead first tossed his head and bumped her arm in the impatient way he had when he wanted to go out into the paddock, and she put her face against his neck and let herself feel the relief of it. And when she straightened up, she found Gilbert standing a few feet away, leaning on the stall door with his arms folded, watching her with an expression she did not know yet how to fully read. "Told you," he said. "Do not be smug," Emma said, but she was smiling. He smiled back, and the smile reached his eyes, and that was the moment. She pinpointed it afterward with the precision of someone who replays things, when she understood that she had already fallen and was simply in the process of landing. Christmas was quiet. Jesse went to visit his sister in Raton, and Cal had gone back to wherever Cal went between seasons. And Emma and Gilbert were alone at the ranch, with the snow pressing in on all sides and the world reduced to the small, warm radius of the house and the stable, and the sounds of the cattle in the far pasture calling across the cold air. Emma made a proper dinner on Christmas Day, a roasted chicken from the yard, cornbread, the last of the preserved peaches from the root cellar put up with sugar and a little cinnamon. It was the kind of meal she would have made for her father if he were alive, and she made it now for both of them without self-consciousness. And when they sat down to eat, Gilbert looked at the table and then at her and said, "This is a very fine Christmas dinner, Emma." And it was the first time he had used her given name. She had used his for weeks by then, without quite noticing when she had made the transition. She noticed now that he had made it too. "Thank you, Gilbert," she said, and poured the coffee. After dinner, they sat by the stove with the snow coming down outside and the wind occasionally pushing at the windows, and Emma brought out a book she had been working through, a collection of narrative essays about natural history that had belonged to her father, and Gilbert read a newspaper, and after a while he set the newspaper down and said, without looking up from it, "I have been writing to the Territorial Land Office about Warren Greer." She looked up. "I want to find out if there is a pattern," he said. "If he sold the same land to more people than just your father, and if so, I want to see if there is a way to get the law interested in finding him." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she asked. He looked up then. "Because your father deserved better, because if Greer did this to your family, he likely did it to others, and because," he stopped, looked at the stove, "because I have been living on this land for 3 months now, and I know what went into it, and it sits wrong with me that the man responsible for the injustice of it is somewhere out there living on what he took." Emma closed her book. "The Territorial Marshal's office," she said. "They handle fraud cases. Howard Bellamy knows the marshal." "I thought you might know who to talk to," he said, and the quiet confidence of that, his assumption that she would know, his habit of treating her knowledge as a given hit her in a way that was small and significant at once. They wrote the letter together that evening, Emma drafting and Gilbert reading and both of them revising, and they sent it with the next mail rider out of Cimarron. January was the hard month. The cold settled in with the persistence of a creditor, and the cattle needed constant tending. Emma and Gilbert fell into a rhythm that was, by now, as natural as the rhythm of the ranch itself. He did not try to override her decisions. She did not exclude him from hers. They disagreed occasionally, about which pasture to move the herd to when the south water froze, about whether to accept a proposed price from a buyer who came through in late January, and the disagreements were honest and concluded without damage. One afternoon in late January, when the cold had broken briefly, and the sky had the pale, clear quality that comes in winter when the air is still and clean, Emma was coming back from the creek pasture on Copperhead, and she came around the stand of cottonwoods near the fence and saw Gilbert standing in the open field with his face turned up to the sky. Just standing there, still, in the cold sunlight, with his hat in his hand. She pulled Copperhead up and watched from a distance. He stood like that for a long moment, just a man in a field looking at the sky. Then he put his hat back on and started back toward the stable, and he saw her watching and stopped. "Sorry," he called, "just thinking." She walked Copperhead forward. "About what?" He was quiet for a beat. Then, "About how much I like it here," he said simply. "How different it is from what I expected." He looked around at the winter pasture, the distant mountains, the ranch buildings against the sky. "I expected an empty piece of land with a deed attached. I got this." He gestured slightly helplessly, as though the word for what he meant was located somewhere just past the reach of his hand. Emma looked at him in the winter light. "I know what you mean," she said, "though I think from my side of it I would say I expected to be fighting for my home and found someone I was willing to share it with instead." He looked at her. The silence was the kind that has weight. "Emma," he said. "Do not say anything foolish," she said quickly, because she was not ready, not quite, for whatever was about to happen, and she needed the timing to be hers as much as his. "I was not going to say anything foolish," he said, with a smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "I was going to say that I am grateful for your patience and your fairness and the fact that you did not shoot me when you had every reason to." She laughed, and it came out warmer than she intended. "I still have the shotgun," she said. "I know," he said. "I find it oddly reassuring." February brought a letter back from the Territorial Marshal's office. A deputy marshal named Aaron Wiley wrote to say that Warren Greer was known to them, had in fact been the subject of an investigation in 2 other counties where similar fraudulent land sales had been recorded, and that the information in Emma and Gilbert's letter had been helpful in building a case. He was not at present in custody, but the investigation was active. Emma read the letter at the breakfast table and felt something release in her chest that she had been holding since the day Gilbert Lawson rode up the lane. "It does not give my father his money back," she said. "No," Gilbert said, "it does not." "But someone is looking," she said. "Someone is looking," he agreed. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the box where she kept the important papers, and then she poured more coffee and they talked about the spring calving schedule, and the ordinary weight of the day settled back around them like a comfortable coat. It was not until March, when the first warmth came back to the air, and the mud season made the roads treacherous and the creek ran high with snowmelt, that Gilbert Lawson finally said the thing that had been building in the space between them since December. He said it on a Tuesday evening after supper, when Emma was at the table with her ledgers and he was supposed to be at the far end of the same table reading, but had been for some time not reading and instead watching her with the kind of sustained attention she had begun to recognize. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked up. He had left his hat on the hook by the door for once, she noticed. He sat at the table across from her with his hands flat on the wood and his expression the most unguarded she had seen it. "I came here," he said, "expecting a piece of land, an inheritance, something to start over with after a hard few years. I did not come here expecting to find someone." He paused. "I certainly did not come here expecting to find someone who would change, quite completely, the idea I had of what I wanted my life to look like." Emma set down her pen. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for a while. I am telling you now because it has gotten to the point where not saying it feels like a lie, and I do not want to lie to you about anything. I do not expect anything in return. He stopped. "I needed you to know." The room was very quiet. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the wind was pushing against the south wall with a sound like a long breath. Emma looked at him for a long moment, this man who had ridden up her lane with a deed and a gray horse and a pair of honest eyes, who had shaken her hand instead of demanding her submission, who had sat up through a cold night for a horse that was not his because it mattered to her, who had written letters to the marshal about a wrong done to a man he had never met because it sat wrong with him to leave it alone. "I know," she said. "I have known for a while." He did not look away. And she got up from the table and crossed to his side of it, which she had never done before in quite that way, and she sat down across from him, not with the width of the table between them, but in the chair beside him, close enough that she could see the way his jaw tightened with the effort of waiting for what she was going to say. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been fighting it since December because it seemed too fast and too complicated and entirely inconvenient." He let out a breath he had clearly been holding for some time. "It is all of those things," he said. "Yes," she said. "But it is also the truest thing that has happened to me since I do not know when, and I have never been very good at pretending the true things are not there." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His thumb moved across her knuckles once, and the tenderness of it made something in Emma that had been braced for a very long time go loose and soft. "I should like to court you properly," he said, "if you will let me." "We live in the same house," Emma said. "We have been working together for 6 months. I think the courtship has been happening for a while." "Then I should like to acknowledge it properly," he amended. "That," Emma said, "I will allow." Spring came in full and furious that year, the way it sometimes did in the New Mexico territory, a rush of warmth and green, and the smell of water on dry earth, everything erupting at once as though the land had been holding its breath through the winter and had finally been given permission to breathe. The calving season kept them both occupied in a way that left little room for anything soft or romantic, but the courtship Gilbert had named was woven into the ordinary fabric of their days in ways that were all the more real for being practical. He brought her coffee in the morning before she came downstairs. She left the lamp burning when she knew he was coming in late from checking the cattle. He repaired the fence on the north side that had been worrying her since fall, unasked, and she came out to find it done and stood for a moment looking at the neat new posts and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the spring sun. They rode together in the evenings when the day's work was done, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both were equally comfortable. Jesse Prout came back from Raton in March and took one look at the way the air sat between Emma and Gilbert and said nothing for a very long time, and then, one afternoon when he and Emma were repairing the henhouse roof, said without preamble, "He is a decent man." Emma did not pretend not to know who he was talking about. "I know," she said. "Your father would have liked him," Jesse said. Emma was quiet for a moment, fitting a shingle into place. "That is the kindest thing you could have said to me," she said. Jesse handed her another shingle. "It is the truth," he said. Thomas Aldridge valued a man who did not make excuses and did not make promises he did not intend to keep. "Your man does neither." "He is not my man yet," Emma said. "He is going to be," Jesse said, with the confidence of someone who has watched a great many things from a long way off for a very long time. He was right, of course. On an evening in late April, Gilbert asked Emma to walk with him down to the creek. The cottonwoods were leafed out in pale new green, and the water was running clear and fast from the snowmelt. And the light was that particular quality of late afternoon in spring that turns everything gold and close and impossibly vivid. They sat on the bank for a while and watched the water and talked about nothing important: the calving numbers, the condition of the south pasture, a letter Emma had received from a cousin in Missouri that was full of news about a world she had moved so far from it felt like reading about a foreign country. Then Gilbert went quiet in the way that by now she recognized, and when she looked at him, he was looking at her with the full weight of those gray eyes. "I want to ask you something," he said, and reached into the pocket of his coat and took out a small object that he held for a moment in his closed hand before opening his palm to show her. It was a ring. Small, simple, a band of gold with a single pale stone that caught the afternoon light and held it. "This was my mother's," he said. "My uncle kept it for me. It was the only thing he had of hers." His voice was steady, but she could hear the care behind it, the way he was holding something very dear. "I have been carrying it in my pocket for 3 weeks trying to find the right moment, and I have decided there is not a right moment. There is just this moment, and I would rather have this one than any right one." Emma looked at the ring. She looked at him. "Gilbert," she said. "I love you," he said. "I love this ranch and this land and this life, but what I love more than any of it is you. And I want to spend the rest of my life here with you if you will have me. Not as a partner in a business arrangement and not as a man with a deed. As your husband, if you will have me." The creek ran past. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. The light was gold on everything. "Yes," Emma said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit, which felt like a sign, though Emma was not generally given to signs. He held her hand in both of his for a moment, and then he leaned forward and kissed her for the first time, and it was gentle and certain and full of all the months of careful waiting, and Emma kissed him back with everything she had been carrying since December, which turned out to be quite a lot. When they walked back up to the house, the light had started to go rose and pink at the edges, and Emma felt the world arranged around her in a way it had not been for a long time, not since before her father died, perhaps. Not a perfect arrangement, but a true one. They were married in Cimarron on the 3rd Saturday of June, 1883, in the small white church on the end of the main street, which had been built 3 years before and still smelled of new wood and whitewash. Howard Bellamy stood up for Gilbert. Jesse Prout walked Emma down the aisle, which made him so proud and so solemn he barely spoke for the rest of the day. There were perhaps 30 people present, the ranchers and townspeople who knew Emma from her years of working the land, and attending every public meeting and trading in every local business. A few people who had known Franklin Lawson by name if not by sight, and Don Abernathy from Springer, who had driven 2 hours to attend because, as he told Gilbert afterward, he liked to see things turn out right. Emma wore a dress she had made herself from pale blue wool and good lace she had ordered from Santa Fe 3 months before. She carried wildflowers from the creek bank, yellow and white, tied with a ribbon. Gilbert wore his best coat, freshly brushed, and his boots were polished to a shine that cost him an hour of the morning. He looked, Jesse told him while they were waiting in the church, like a man who understood the weight of what he was doing. "I do," Gilbert said, which made Jessie laugh, which was not a common occurrence. When the minister said his words and Gilbert and Emma said theirs, there was a particular moment, just after they had exchanged their vows, and just before the minister pronounced them married, when they looked at each other across the small charged space of what they were committing to, and Emma saw in Gilbert's face the same thing she felt in her own chest. Not just love, which was there in full measure, but something calmer and deeper, a recognition, as though the two of them had been headed toward this specific moment from a long way off, and had simply been finding their way to it through the particular route their lives had provided. Then the minister pronounced them, and the room applauded with the warm, uncomplicated happiness of people who are genuinely glad for a thing, and Gilbert took Emma's face in his hands and kissed her properly in front of the entire congregation, and Emma heard Jessie Prout clear his throat behind her in the elaborate way of a man doing his best not to cry. They went home to the ranch that evening, back through the country that was theirs together now. The land and the buildings and the cattle and the creek with its cottonwoods and the mountains in the west turning purple in the evening light. And Emma stood on the porch in the warm June dark while Gilbert put the horses up, and she looked out at all of it and felt the full settled weight of everything she had built and fought for and refused to give up on. Now grown to include something she had not built and not fought for and had not known she needed, until it arrived on her lane on a September morning with a piece of paper and an honest face. The first summer of their marriage was the best summer Emma could remember, not because nothing went wrong, plenty went wrong, in the way that plenty always went wrong on a working ranch. One of the wells went shallow and needed work. A portion of the north fence came down in a thunderstorm, and they lost 3 cattle before they could find them and bring them back. The price of beef dropped in August in a way that made the October delivery to Abernathy less profitable than they had planned. But none of it broke them, because none of it came at them alone. They met every problem together, argued about the solution sometimes, chose the best available answer and acted on it and moved on. This, Emma understood, was what she had watched her parents do, this quiet teamwork in the face of the ordinary disasters of a difficult life. And seeing it reproduced in her own marriage filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. There were other things that summer, better things. There were evenings on the porch with the country going gold and purple around them and coffee cooling in their hands, and the conversation ranging from the practical to the philosophical and back again, without effort. There were the first experiments with planting a kitchen garden that was larger and more ambitious than Emma's previous efforts, with Gilbert's help in breaking the new ground. There were rides in the early morning before the heat came up, through the creek pasture and up toward the higher ground, with the territory spread below them in the clear morning light. And there were the quieter, more private things, the particular joy of learning a person fully, and finding that what you learn only deepens the thing that brought you there in the first place. Emma had believed herself to be someone who did not need very much, who had organized her life around self-sufficiency so thoroughly that the need itself had gone quiet from lack of use. What she discovered, married to Gilbert Lawson, was that she had not lacked the need so much as the right person to need, and now that the right person was here, the need came back to life alongside everything else. In October of that first married year, a letter arrived from the territorial marshal's office. Warren Greer had been located in Arizona Territory and was in custody. He had been charged with land fraud in 4 separate cases, including the sale of the Aldridge Ranch to Thomas Aldridge. There would be a legal proceeding in the spring. The letter asked if Emma and Gilbert would be willing to submit their documentation to the court. Emma read the letter twice and then folded it and put it in the box with the rest of the important papers and sat for a moment at the kitchen table before going to find Gilbert, who was in the stable. She handed him the letter without a word and watched him read it. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "It does not fix what happened to your father," he said. "No," Emma said, but it fixes something. It means the next Thomas Aldridge might not happen. She took the letter back. I want to send our documents. So do I, he said. They sent everything they had. In the spring, they received word that Greer had been convicted and sentenced to 7 years in the Yuma Territorial Prison, and that restitution had been ordered in the cases where the defrauded parties could be located. Though Emma's father's estate was harder to address since Thomas Aldridge was deceased and Emma could not prove, legally, the direct loss through the chain of ownership. It was not perfect, but it was justice of a kind. And Emma, who was a practical woman, knew that justice was rarely perfect and was more valuable when it was honest than when it was complete. She and Gilbert went to Cimarron that day and had dinner at the hotel restaurant, which was a thing they did only on occasions that warranted it, and they had a proper meal with white tablecloths and wine that came in a real bottle and a dessert that was extravagant by any standard they usually applied. And Emma told the story of her father to Gilbert properly. The whole story, from the beginning, who he had been, where he had come from, what he had believed about land and work and the obligations of honest people to each other, in a way she had never told it before because she had never before had someone who was in the right position to receive it. Gilbert listened to all of it. He did not say at the end that he was sorry. He said, "He gave you everything you are. That is a real inheritance." And Emma took his hand across the white tablecloth and held it, and the evening outside the restaurant window was warm and full of the sounds of a western town going about its life, and she felt her father very close, not as a grief but as a presence approving. The news that Emma was expecting came in the spring of 1884, and it came to both of them the way big news always comes, as a fact that immediately begins reorganizing everything around it. Gilbert was, when she told him, completely still for a moment that lasted just long enough to make her wonder, and then he was across the kitchen and his arms were around her, and he said her name against her hair, just her name, and she felt his heart beating fast against her, and she understood that the stillness had been the moment of the fact landing, and what came after was how he actually felt. "Are you frightened?" he asked, still holding her. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "And glad, both at the same time." "That seems about right," Emma said. Jesse Prout, when they told him, did the throat-clearing thing again, more extensively than usual. He said that it was fine news and that he would take on the extra work without complaint. And he did, showing up 4 days a week instead of 3 through the summer without being asked, because Jesse was the kind of man who did the right thing when it needed doing and declined to make any particular ceremony of it. The summer was difficult in the way that pregnancy in a working ranch life is difficult. Emma refused to stop working, though she adjusted what she took on, and Gilbert managed the heavier physical demands with a matter-of-fact protectiveness that she appreciated because it came without condescension. He did not tell her what she could not do. He simply made sure that whatever she needed to do, she did not have to do alone. They argued once in August about how much she was doing, and the argument was heated for about 15 minutes, and then they both ran out of steam at the same time and stood in the kitchen looking at each other, and Emma said, "I know you are worried," and Gilbert said, "I know you know what you are capable of," and that was the end of it. The baby came in November, late autumn, with the cold pressing in, and the wood stove burning hot, and Doc Hands from Cimarron driving out in his buggy through weather that was not entirely cooperative. It was a boy. A large, noisy, red-faced boy who arrived with the kind of vigorous indignation that suggested he had strong opinions about the whole process and intended to make them known. Emma was exhausted and triumphant in the way of women who have been through something enormous and come out the other side of it, and Gilbert sat beside her bed with her hand in his and the baby in the crook of her arm, and looked at both of them with an expression Emma could not find a word for. It was past happiness, past relief. It was the look of a man who has arrived at a place he did not know he had been traveling toward his whole life. "What do we call him?" Emma asked. Gilbert was quiet for a moment. His thumb moved over her hand. "Franklin," he said, "if you are willing, for my uncle." Emma looked at the baby, who had gone suddenly and thoroughly to sleep in the way of newborns who have exhausted their initial complaints. "Franklin Thomas," she said, "for both of them." Gilbert's hand tightened on hers. "Franklin Thomas Lawson," he said. "Yes," Emma said, "that is exactly right." The winter that followed was the kind of winter that reminds you of what it means to be alive, not comfortable, necessarily, but present, real. The days full of the particular vivid texture of new life in a small space in the cold. The baby's sounds filling the house in a way that changed the quality of the silence when he slept. The fire in the stove burning all day and all night. The smell of wood smoke and milk and coffee that became, for Emma, the smell of this time, this life. This thing they were building together. Jessie came to see the baby the day after the birth and stood looking at him in Emma's arms with an expression that resolved, eventually, into something that looked very much like he had been given something back that he had thought he had lost. Thomas would have been pleased, Jessie said, which was the only thing he said, and it was enough. Gilbert, Emma discovered, was a natural father in the same way he was a natural rancher. Not because it was easy for him, but because he was fully present for it, attentive and patient and willing to learn the things he did not know. He was up in the night without complaint, walked the baby when the baby would not be put down, learned the particular angle of hold that settled Franklin Thomas into contentment when nothing else would. He was, in this, as in everything else, reliable. Emma watched him sometimes, early in the morning when the house was still dark and she could hear him moving around with the baby, and she felt a love for him so large and uncomplicated that it surprised her still, even now, even months past the declaration on the creek bank. She had not expected any of this. She had not expected to share her home, her ranch, her life. She had not expected to find, in a stranger with a piece of paper and an honest face, the person who would make all of it more than she had already built it to be. By the spring of 1885, the ranch was thriving in a way that Emma had not let herself fully hope for in those hard years alone. The herd had grown. The land was well managed. The relationship with Don Abernathy had expanded into a regular supply contract that gave them predictable income through the selling season. They had hired 2 additional hands for the busy months, in addition to Jessie's permanent presence. Gilbert had taken over most of the direct cattle management, which freed Emma to handle the business side, the contracts, the banking, the relationships with buyers and suppliers, with an efficiency she had always been capable of but had never before been able to apply undivided. They fit together in the operation the way they fit together in everything else. Not identically, not interchangeably, but complementarily, each doing what they were best at and trusting the other to do what they were not. Howard Bellamy came out to the ranch that spring to finalize some paperwork related to the partnership agreement, and when the business was done, he stayed for coffee and looked around the kitchen, at Emma at the table with her ledgers, at the baby in his basket near the stove, at Gilbert coming in from outside and pulling off his gloves and going to look at the baby the way he always did when he came in. Just a quick look, checking, and Bellamy said, with the satisfied air of a man who is fond of a good resolution, "I have handled a great many land disputes over the years, and I have never seen one end like this." "No," Emma said. "Most of them end in a courtroom," Bellamy said, "or worse." "We chose the sensible option," Gilbert said, coming to pour his coffee. "You chose the rare option," Bellamy said, "which turned out to be the same thing." Jessie Prout, who had been listening from the doorway where he was trying to remove mud from his boots without tracking it into the kitchen, made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was hard to say. With Jessie, it was always hard to say. The letter from Deputy Marshal Wiley that arrived in the summer of 1885 was brief and factual. Warren Greer had served 2 years of his sentence in Yuma and had died of a fever in the prison infirmary. The case was closed. The letter offered no apology and no sentimentality, because it was a legal document and not a eulogy. Emma read it at the breakfast table while the baby, who was 8 months old, and had recently discovered that he could pull himself to standing by holding the edge of anything available, which had made all the lower surfaces of the kitchen into objects of his intense personal interest, was engaged in this activity against the leg of Emma's chair. She read the letter, and then she read it again, and then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. "Warren Greer is dead," she told Gilbert when he came in. He sat down. "How? Fever in the prison." He was quiet for a moment. The baby had made his way around the chair leg and had now taken hold of Gilbert's boot and was investigating it with the same systematic interest he brought to everything. "I will not pretend to grieve him," Gilbert said. "No," Emma said. "I will not either." She poured his coffee and set it in front of him and sat back down. "But I am glad he was caught. I am glad there is a record of what he did." She looked at the baby, who had sat down abruptly on the kitchen floor and was now looking at the boot with an expression of philosophical consideration. "I am glad my son will grow up in a world where that much, at least, was done." Gilbert looked at her, and then at the baby, and then back at her. "Franklin Thomas," he said, "stop eating my boot." The baby looked up at him with large gray eyes. He had Gilbert's eyes, the same clear storm-like color, in Emma's face, and made a sound of cheerful disagreement and went back to the boot. Emma laughed, and it rang through the kitchen like something precious and ordinary at once. The years that followed were full years, full of work and weather, and the cycles of ranching life, full of the small daily dramas of a household with a growing child in it, full of the particular texture of a marriage between two people who had chosen each other not from desperation or convention, but from something that had arrived on them slowly and honestly and stayed. Franklin Thomas Lawson grew into a boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's sharp tongue, and a curiosity about the natural world that led him to investigate everything within reach, and to bring home, regularly, specimens of the territory's flora and fauna that were not always welcome in the house. He was 4 when his sister arrived, Margaret, called Maggie, who had Emma's dark hair and a personality that from the very beginning seemed to be organized around the single principle that she intended to run things. The children were different from each other in most ways and identical in the essential one, which was that they were loved and they knew it. Jesse Pruitt worked on the ranch until he was 67, when his knees made the work genuinely impractical, and then he retired to a small house in Cimarron that Emma and Gilbert helped him secure, and he came out to the ranch for Sunday dinners with the regularity of someone who considers himself family, which he was. The partnership agreement that Emma and Gilbert had signed with Howard Bellamy's help in September of 1882 was revisited and formalized properly in the years that followed, incorporating all the changes that time and marriage and children and the growth of the operation had brought, until it was not really a partnership agreement at all anymore, but simply the legal documentation of a life that had grown well past what any document could fully contain. One evening in the autumn of 1887, Emma and Gilbert sat on the porch in the cooling air with coffee in their hands, and the last light going gold across the pasture, and the mountains holding it a little longer than the valley below. Franklin Thomas was inside doing something with rocks that he had told his mother was a geological survey, which she had chosen to accept at face value. Maggie was asleep, which was always, at age 2, somewhat miraculous and not to be disturbed. The cattle were in from the high ground. The wood was cut and stacked. The accounts were settled and the winter provisions were in order. The ranch hummed around them in the particular quiet of a place that has been properly prepared for what is coming. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Emma said. "Tell me," Gilbert said. "That morning," she said, "when you rode up the lane. The hens scattered and I came out with the shotgun and you just," she shook her head, "you just sat on that horse and did not flinch, and I thought either this man is dangerous or he is very certain of his position." "I was certain of my position," Gilbert said, "and also somewhat afraid." Emma looked at him. "You were, deeply," he said. "You had a shotgun. You were clearly not inclined toward conversation, and you were—" He paused. He looked at her in the autumn light with those gray eyes that she knew so thoroughly by now that she could read the weather in them the way a rancher reads the sky. "You were the most formidable person I had ever seen in my life, standing on a porch in the September morning, and I was aware immediately that whatever was going to happen, the outcome was going to be determined largely by you. And yet you did not leave," Emma said. "I had nowhere to go," he said, which was factually true. "But you also did not," she searched for the word. "You did not try to overpower it, the situation. You just told me the truth and put the papers on the table." "It was the only thing that made sense," he said. "It was the only thing," Emma said, "that had any chance of working." She looked out at the pasture, at the mountains holding the last of the light. "I did not expect to like you. I was prepared to fight you for years if necessary, and instead I had to admit fairly quickly that you were a decent man who had done nothing wrong and was dealing with the situation honestly." She turned to look at him. "It was entirely inconvenient." "I know," he said. "You told me so in December." "I am glad I did," she said. "So am I," he said. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and they sat together in the cooling autumn evening and looked out at the land that was theirs, both of theirs, wholly and without qualification, the deed and the improvements and the years of honest work and the children asleep inside, and the cattle in the pasture and the creek running clear in the lower field, and the mountains going dark against a sky that had turned the color of deep water. In the spring of 1889, a second son arrived, James, who was from the first moment of his life the most relaxed and contented person in the Lawson household, a quality his parents found both baffling and deeply welcome. He slept when he was supposed to sleep and ate when he was supposed to eat, and regarded the world around him with a placid good humor that Franklin Thomas found philosophically interesting and Maggie found personally insulting, as she had always found contentment in others somewhat suspicious. The family was complete, in the sense that a family is complete when it is simply itself, fully and without apology, not because there could be no more additions, but because what was already here was so thoroughly and essentially right that any further additions would simply be more of a good thing rather than the filling of a gap. The ranch continued to grow. Gilbert took on a lease on the adjacent parcel when its owner moved east in 1890, extending their grazing range and giving them room to expand the herd into territory that had been underleveraged for years. Emma negotiated a supply contract with a new beef processor in Raton that was the most profitable contract the ranch had ever held. They hired a full-time cook, which liberated Emma from the kitchen in a way she had not realized she needed until it happened, and she spent the time it freed on the business side of the operation with a concentrated efficiency that increased their profitability in the first year by more than she had expected. They were not wealthy people, not by the standards of the great cattle barons. They were prosperous people, which is a different thing and in many ways a better one, not so much that the work ceased to be meaningful, not so little that the worry was constant, but in the workable middle ground where the days had purpose and the evenings had ease and the life made sense. On an evening in the summer of 1891, when the children were in their beds and the ranch was quiet and the New Mexico night was enormous above them, Emma and Gilbert stood at the fence of the home pasture and looked at the land they had made together. It had been 9 years since that September morning when he rode up the lane. 9 years since the shotgun and the papers and the uneasy supper and the slow, careful business of learning to trust. 9 years since the creek bank and the ring that had been his mother's. 9 years of calving seasons and cattle drives and hard winters and good summers and arguments and resolutions and children and loss and joy in the full complex measure that a real life provides. "I never thanked you properly," Gilbert said. Emma looked at him. "For what?" "For not shooting me," he said. "The first morning," she laughed. It was the same laugh, still warm, still capable of surprising both of them. "I thanked myself for that plenty," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, the way she always did, with a completeness that required no adjustment. They stood at the fence in the summer night, and the land stretched out before them. Their land, the creek land, the pasture land, the land their children would inherit and remember and carry forward into the next century that was already pressing in at the edges. And above them the sky was the enormous unrepeatable sky of the Western Territory at night, stars in their full and uncountable numbers, the Milky Way a river of pale light from one horizon to the other. "I want to tell you something," Emma said. "Tell me," Gilbert said, the way he always said it. "I am glad it happened the way it did," she said, "all of it. The mess and the complication and the shotgun and the partnership and the whole strange root of it." She looked up at him. "I would not trade it for a simpler story." "Neither would I," he said, and he meant it down to the bones. He kissed her temple, and she turned her face up, and he kissed her properly, and the summer night held them in it, and the ranch spread around them in every direction, and everything was resolved and known and right. And the story of how they had found their way to this was no longer a dispute over land or a conflict over a deed, but was simply the story of how Emma Aldridge and Gilbert Lawson had come, from opposite directions and by honest roads, to the same good place, and had built there together. Everything that mattered. The morning came early, as mornings always did. The sun came up over the eastern hills and laid its light across the Lawson ranch, across the pasture and the creek and the cattle moving in the distance, across the stable where the horses were beginning to stir, across the kitchen garden that had long since outgrown its original boundaries, across the porch where the hens roosted each night and scattered each morning, and through the kitchen window where the stove was already lit, and the coffee was already on, and Franklin Thomas, 12 years old now, and taking after his mother in the particular way that meant he was already up and reading, sat at the table with a book. Maggie came down next, because Maggie was never far behind when there was a morning to be managed. Then James, rolling in at his own unhurried pace with his hair still wild from sleep and his expression serene. And then Emma, and then Gilbert, coming down together in the easy way of people who have been married long enough that the morning is simply a continuation of the night before, and whose lives are so thoroughly intermixed that the individual strands of them are no longer quite separable. Emma poured coffee and Gilbert took his cup and looked at his children at the table and at the ranch outside the window and at his wife beside him, and felt, as he felt every morning, the full settled rightness of where he was and how he had arrived there. He had not expected to find the ranch occupied. She had not expected to like the man who said it was his. And from those two unexpected things had come everything, every good and real and lasting thing that either of them would ever need.